Welcome to Bridge the Divide podcast. A podcast where church leaders have real and honest conversations about issues of race and the way forward to racial reconciliation. Subscribe wherever you find podcasts or watch the video version over on YouTube. Welcome to Bridge the Divide, episode 5 today.
Episode 5.
Yeah, and we don't want our audience to get the impression that we're only addressing the white church in our conversations, but really we want this to be a place where everyone can learn and engage, and we want to bridge the divide to all sides. So today we want to kind of have a more conversation about what does the black church need to know or do in terms of helping bring racial reconciliation.
Ooh, that's a good question. And right away, y'all look at me, don't you? See?
That's right.
I mean, yeah.
Well, again, welcome to Bridge the Divide. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Kirby. This is Matt. This is David. We live in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We're doing church together. We're in the process of planning this multi-ethnic church. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast is so that we can just talk through some of the stuff like in the car and when we're in meetings and when we're at lunch. Like we have all these interesting conversations about faith and race and just all the things going on. So we just wanted to bring that to the world, to the church, to the greater everybody. So we have this opportunity now to talk. And we want to talk a little bit about black church today. So again, these brothers are staring at me because I guess I'm the only one at the table that grew up in a black church.
So and we'll just say this. We've said this in other podcasts as well. We're not necessarily the experts of everything. We're out here riffing. We're doing our best. We're pastors in the city. We wrestle with these things. We study these things. That doesn't mean we have all the answers either, but we're going to approach this in hopefully a humble way, discussing these issues and things that we need to discuss.
Yeah, and at the same time, we unashamedly want to articulate our perspective on these things as we study scripture and how we see these things kind of lived out. So I guess to start with, I grew up, of course, in a black church. Well, I shouldn't say of course, because just because I'm black don't mean I went to a black church, right? But I did grow up in a black church, but specifically, I grew up in the oldest black church in the state of Wisconsin. So there's a historical context even to the church I grew up in and history and legacy and that kind of thing. We came to Wisconsin because my dad got called to pastor that church. So as a baby, I moved to the state of Wisconsin. My dad was called to pastor this church, and that really began the life of faith for me in the black church and families and community and just everything that it meant to serve and grow up and learn in that church. But I think to understand the black church, we have to take it a step back even further and kind of have some conversation about how the black church actually began in the United States. How did the black church come to be? And the quick answer, I would say 1777, the first African church or Baptist church is probably the oldest registered black church in the United States in Savannah, Georgia. Basically, a preacher began preaching to slaves in Savannah and was able to establish this church that would become the first African Baptist church. And that was kind of the beginning of the black church. A few years later in Philadelphia, the Methodists begin to allow African Americans into the Methodist church. And so in that, they raised up basically a black preacher to help serve the black people that were part of the church. That black preacher was a man by the name of Richard Allen. And basically after his frustration with segregation and how black congregants were treated, they staged a walkout from St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. And that ultimately birthed the AME denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that started in Philadelphia. Absalom Jones, Richard Allen started that movement that ultimately became, again, one of the oldest black denominations in the country. And so those two churches, those two movements are really the genesis, if you will, of what we know as the black church. And if you study the story in Savannah, Georgia, of First African Church, the guy that started the church, like he was beaten and whipped and jailed and discouraged from starting this church for blacks and for slaves. And when you study the stories and these movements, like you see such adversity and such persecution, if you will, as these churches are forged in the United States. So one of the things we need to understand, I guess, in our conversation is that the black church was born out of segregation.
Yeah.
It was born out of being alienated, out of the pain of what it meant to be black in America. And so we see this interesting development over time, not only as black folk are gospelized or ministered to get the gospel, but as black folk begin to understand the story of the gospel and the story of faith, and particularly the Exodus.
Yes.
One of the draws of the black church in its earlier days was the Exodus.
Sure.
And the story of Moses and how Israel had been under 400 years of slavery and oppression, and how God then leads those people out of slavery.
Absolutely.
And so as black thinkers and church leaders and pastors begin to read the Bible for themselves, and they're able to read these stories and understand it, it was a tremendous source of hope. It was a tremendous source of, it created this theological framework that wait a minute, God's plan for us is not for us to be slaves. Yeah. There's this understanding that in God, there is the potential for freedom. And maybe God even supports our freedom and us moving towards that. And so it became an amazing draw, and really the foundation of the black church in those days.
Sure.
Was this understanding of freedom, this understanding of equality, this understanding of black people's place in the story. Because before that, you have to understand there were only these plantation churches. And of course, the only passage preached to slaves was slaves obey your masters.
Yes.
Right. And so it wasn't until blacks are allowed to have their own churches, right, that they begin to have a deeper understanding of scripture and freedom and Jesus. And so they begin to connect the dots on these things, our humanity and our faith, and how they align with one another. And so that kind of fuels the growth and development of the black church for hundreds of years after that. And then this is the main thing as well. When you look at black church, the black church was the first and only thing that black people had in this country that was ours.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't, white people didn't oversee it, didn't control it, didn't run it. It was ours. And for black folks, particularly in the late 1700s, the 1800s, heck, even up to the 1960s.
Yeah.
It was a place of dignity. It was a place of respect. It was this epicenter of black life and black culture. Because again, it was the only thing that we had that was ours. It was the first place that a black man could go to and a black woman and not be called boy or the N-word or, coon and all the other derogatory names. Like wrap your mind around a grown man working a job and somebody 10 or 20 years younger than him being their supervisor, calling him boy every day of his life. A fully adult, mature man being called a boy for the entirety of his life. And so the black church represented the space where this same gentleman could be Mr. or deacon or reverend.
Reverend or doctor. It's the place where folks and people of color could get education.
That's right.
And it was the one place that seemed in America at that time acceptable. Like, of course, the pastor has a level of education, a level, you know what I'm saying?
That's right.
Yeah, to your point, that's absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah, and so the epicenter of black life was born out of the black church. Because it was the only thing that was ours. It was the only thing that even economically, you bring money together. Of course, the church raised offerings. And so the church was able to use money, whether that was to educate people, whether it was to feed people, whether it was for voter registration, whether it was for abolition, whether it was for civil rights, all these different things over time were birthed out of the black church. But the black church was born out of a necessity.
Yep.
It wasn't like voluntary, we don't want to be with white people. It was born out of a necessity. It was born out of the fact that black folk were treated differently and weren't allowed and weren't treated as equals, even in the context of church.
Because if I'm understanding, history and stuff, right, while slavery was legal, everyone did church together. There was one, like you said, the plantation church. But it wasn't until after slavery, right, when segregation happened, and it was like, no, you can't be a part of our church anymore, and so that was when the split happened.
I mean, kind of, because in some pockets it was happening already. Like in Philadelphia, that it wasn't a slave state,
right?
So free blacks, when you look at the story of Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, the AME Church, they were free blacks. But now let me say this: this is something that people miss out on. There was still quite a bit of segregation and racism in the free states.
Yeah.
It was just a better option than slavery. So there were still colored only sections. Even in St. George's, part of the issue with those black families leaving that church, kind of in protest, was that the treatment. You could only sit in the balcony. You could only be in this section. You couldn't come to the altar and kneel. There were all these kind of regulations and rules in place, even though these were free folk. So it was out of frustration with those systems that they said, we're going to organize our own church where we can feel equal and feel, you know what I mean? So it was both and, because you have this movement of churches that are being born in free states. And then you have this movement of churches being born in slave states. So it's an interesting dynamic early on as these churches are developing nationwide, And so there's plantation churches. Sometimes slave owners would bring their slaves with them to church. There was a slave section, and then in other times, they begin to establish churches on actual plantations and send preachers around so that the blacks could congregate on Sunday and have their own form of service and those kinds of things. So you had this dynamic of, in free states, there were these independent churches forming, and then plantation churches begin to form. And one of the elements of some of the plantation churches is it got to the point in a lot of plantations where the owners were comfortable with black folk doing church without their input or influence. Like we didn't have to be there. So Sunday morning was a time for our slaves to do their own service in their slave quarters, that area, and without oversight from white people. And so there was a bit of an organic development of faith in those contexts. You know what I'm saying? And so, it was yes is the answer. But there's a dynamic of both of these things happening at the same time, depending on what part of the country that you're in. And so when we look at the history and heritage of the black church, it's born out of inequality. It's born out of oppression. It's born out of a lack of again, even equality when it comes to faith in church, and the belief that you're good enough to be saved, but you still can't do life in church with us because you're not good enough for that. And that contradiction created the black church, because it didn't make sense. Either we're Christian and we're your brothers, or we're animals and we're not worthy of salvation.
You see pockets of hope and change within that. Like I think of like the Azusa Street Revival when it started out and it being a very multi-ethnic movement. But even then, shortly after it started, segregation started happening, racism started bubbling up, and issues started happening amongst race, and that split churches in this great, I would say, genuine move of God that was happening, then went down the wrong path. And so you see it even defaulting back towards that segregated church once again. It's an interesting thought. Like you see pockets of hope kind of come about. But I would even ask this question, like, what do you think then? So we've been talking through ideas of race and talking about last week how the gospel itself is multi-ethnic. And like we know, at least from scripture, we see that as the hope and some of the answer and what we're stepping towards. How does then this affect the roots of the segregated church? How does this affect the future of an integrated church?
I long to see the day where the black church is not necessary. And over time, as I've wrestled with this issue and this conversation, and just looking at the world around me and what needs to take place, I long for the day where the black church in America is not necessary. And what I mean is there's such a sense of community and multi-ethnic movement that is embracive and celebratory of culture and race and ethnicity in a healthy and spiritual way, that there's not a need to have this separate thing to address the humanity and the culture of black folks in America. You know what I'm saying? That's what I long to see. And so I'm excited by multi-ethnic church work and the opportunity to build a church that does that, which is what we're in the midst of doing, currently. But there's still this tension in recognizing, like, for instance, if we just said the black church needs to shut down right now because it's not helpful, how will black folks integrate into majority culture churches? Right. But my fear is that our culture, our history, worship style, even our perspective of faith will be lost. Yeah. In the current state of majority culture church, it will be lost. Yeah. And Christianity would shift in our country to a narrative of kind of white Christianity, in a sense. Yep.
So let's unpack that a little bit. Let's talk that through, because I think you're touching on something profoundly helpful to just process. And I think we're even processing it kind of out loud together. Yeah. But I think of like first generation churches, and I'm using this as kind of a comparison. So like my mom grew up in Burma, okay? And the people group that her dad ministered to, they're called Zomi people. And they've been leaving their area in Burma, or Myanmar now, they're all around the world now. And there's pockets, and when they come to like America, they stay together because that's the community and the people that they know. And that community not only is the people that they know, but they're the people that are helping them get driver's license, take tests, get jobs, get connected, what it means to be an American. How do I pay taxes? How do I, you know what I'm saying? Like, how do I do those things? And so part of the church is Jesus and faith and growing in your faith in this vertical. But part of the church is this horizontal that we talked about of reaching out to your community and doing those things. And I'm seeing this direct comparison to black church in general of, yes, the vertical is the same. Just, we believe in Jesus, salvation through faith alone, all of those things. But this horizontal is different in terms of ministering to your community that's there. So at what point, or how do we get the church to a place where that specific horizontal is needed less? Because like the danger, like you're saying, is if all of a sudden, wham, it's all just one church right now, then the majority culture, and here that happens to be white culture, in other countries it might be something else, but that majority culture is just going to swallow that up. If all of the Zomi folks who came from Myanmar just joined with all the regular white church, their Zomi culture is gone, their background is gone, their understanding of scriptures and their theologians is just going to get swallowed up by whatever majority culture is. So how do we go about stepping towards a unified church, which is what we believe in, and we believe is the answer, while still maintaining, recognizing black culture, black influences? And this is true of not just black culture, but even as majority culture ministering to Hispanic folks in Kenosha and Asian folks in Kenosha. How do we build a church that is unified, that's multi-ethnic, without crushing or swallowing up completely the culture and just making it majority culture?
So a couple of things. One thing I think that's interesting is you mentioned like the Zomi people, and as they come to the country, and other ethnic groups, when they come to the country, they're able to connect to churches that are out of their culture and then help them navigate what it means to be in America. The interesting nuance is that black folk have been American since 1619, right? So it's a weird dynamic of presence in this country for 401 years now, but not a sense of belonging. Like black stuff, culture, things are often viewed as something other than, and one of the challenges of the culture we live in is that at times we as black folk feel like we're not viewed as American. We're black, and that's a new, like that's not the same as American. But in a lot of ways, black culture is American culture. Absolutely. Even with the differences of perspective and experience in this nation being different, but it is American culture. So it's a weird dynamic when we look at the relationship between black folk and white folk historically in our country. Now that being said, how do we do it? I think we need more and more multi-ethnic churches, but I think we need more multi-ethnic churches that do it a certain way. I think representation at the table. Excuse me, at every turn is extremely important when it comes to multi-ethnic churches. It's not just diversity in representation. It has to go beyond that into this sense of diversity of perspective and an awareness. So when people are at the table, again, at every area of leadership, and I think that's extremely important. Every area of leadership, there's people at the table and people that are serving that are from different backgrounds and multi-ethnic, because then it's shaping how you prepare sermons. It's shaping, the flyers you print and the messaging that goes out. It's shaping your approach to music. It's shaping who's standing at the door. It's not just we want a few black and brown people in our church to show diversity. It's thinking through, how do we say what we say? How do we communicate certain things? How are our initiatives connecting to different people groups? Because oftentimes what happens is there's a heart or burden to be multi-ethnic. And so then white pastors hire some black folk. But the church board is still completely white. The higher up of pastoral staff is still completely white. And so the perspective, the narrative, the culture of that church is kind of white culture. There's just some black folk involved.
I even think in the way that teaching happens or who you point people to, like
that's another thing. That's good.
Commentaries that you're reading when you're studying, things like that. Like what a couple of years ago, we made a genuine effort to diversify our Bible commentaries and to diversify some of the things that we're reading, just to make sure we're getting a broader perspective that isn't just the same echo chamber, the same, you know what I'm saying? And I think that's even something to consider, and it's hard to do.
So I think all those kinds of things are extremely important, so that there is a sense of unity and a sense of celebrating culture, and there's a sense of belonging. Like people can see themselves as a part of the church. People can feel that connection, that the church is connecting to who I am personally and spiritually and ethnically and all those kinds of things. And I think it's extremely important. I also think it's a weird balancing act, because you don't want to be so consumed with issues of ethnicity that it dominates everything you do as a church.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's this balancing act of, are we reaching people in an authentic way? But also we don't want to get so focused on that, because I believe there's elements of church that transcend any culture. When you talk about dominant, minority, there's elements of Jesus, there's moments in worship, there's moves of God that transcends all of that. And so it's not about black or white or Latino, or is this song this or is this song that. But it's this understanding and sensitivity to those things and celebration of those things. And I think celebration is the best way to describe it, because we do bring different nuances to theology and to our approach to public worship and stylistically with music and communication style and all of these things.
And potlucks, glory to God.
Yeah, food, all of that
glory
kind of stuff.
to God.
Right. Absolutely. But to be able to celebrate ethnicity, that God created these differences and he uses them to create this portrait of who he is and what the kingdom looks like, and not shying away from that at every aspect of building the church. So I think it's super important, if we talk about building a multi-ethnic church, building multi-ethnic churches, period, that has that sense of diversity in powerful places. I think that's important. Diversity in powerful places. Because it's much easier to put diversity at the door and greeting teams on the worship team, but in powerful places. Who's the chairman of the board of the church? Who is the lead pastor? Who are the key power broker positions in whatever your church structure is? And are those tables diverse? Because if they're not, then again, you'll have dominant culture in terms of leadership of church, and then you'll have kind of these sprinkles of multi-ethnic individuals throughout. And then what happens is you put something out and you don't know it's insensitive ethnically until after you put it out. And then you get a response from people. And then you got to, but if people were in that room, you know what I'm saying? They're like, don't say that. Let's not put this out this way. Right. Because, this is how it can be interpreted. Because you don't have diversity in powerful places, it's this constant action and reaction versus having people at the table.
Yeah. And it's not just having diversity in leadership so you can be better with your PR.
Correct. Yeah.
Like I think of, that's important, but like I think of just, ministry school, and we talked so much about, you got to understand where your people are at. like what they're going through, what their needs are, where they need to grow. Because if you don't understand that, then you don't understand how. If you know where you need to know where you want them to be and where they are, so you can build a church, you can build programs, you can design small groups or whatever to help people go from where they are to where they need to be. And so if you have a church whose leadership structure, especially at the top, is very much monoethnic, you're only really understanding one group's needs.
That's right.
Where, for me, it'd be, I understand a lot where white people are at and what their needs are and maybe what they need to learn or how they need to grow. But as we're doing multi-ethnic church, I'm constantly asking you, Kirby, like, hey, how can we help our Black brothers and sisters in Christ? What do they need to grow? Like, that's so important to be multi-ethnic. Is we can't just be helping one group of people grow in their faith and meet their practical needs and all those things, but it's got to be everybody, and that's why I think that's one of the main reasons why having a diverse group is important. In your leadership structure.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is important, that we're doing it right, not diversity for PR, not diversity to appear diverse, because I think the danger, and I think the concern is, if you start building multi-ethnic church in a bad way, in a token way, in a awful way, that's actually way worse and detrimental to the Black church. Yeah. Because the Black church, historically speaking, and even modern day speaking, has been a need, has been meeting needs of whole communities who have needed spiritual growth and even community help, community growth, educational growth, whatever it is. And so if all of a sudden a group swoops in and tries to almost take over that, I think that can be detrimental. So,
well, I think the multi-ethnic church should be doing. I think that let me say it.
Yep.
I think the church should be doing those things in general.
Yes.
So when we talk about outreach and doing certain community things, and even inreach, helping people that are part of the body.
Yep.
And we agree on it. This is something the church should be doing in general, right? And so hopefully that if the church kind of is true to its calling and begins to do those things well, the prayer is that there wouldn't be a need for a Black church specifically. And that my hope is that over time that God would raise up in this country more and more churches that are multi-ethnic, that are meeting needs in community, that are willing to do the things you're saying, David, of understanding the people groups that are part of the church and being willing and able to minister in and to those people groups and bring them into the fold as family.
Yeah, that's good.
And my prayer is that the more and more that multi-ethnic churches develop that are doing it that way, that view the gospel as multi-ethnic, that there will be less of a need.
That's good.
And that's my prayer, honestly. No disrespect to the Black church. I want to grab that disclaimer. I'm a product of it. But I just think the gospel calls us to be more than that, And at this point, I just chose to dedicate my life, and you guys as well, to building something that looks different than what we know, in terms of homogeneous churches that are just one ethnicity, like we want to build something that's deeper. And I think there's a challenge to that, especially with Black folks, because this is another interesting thing. It seems like white folk in some ways are very open to multi-ethnic church currently, like it's becoming a movement and people are passionate about it. But I think Black folks don't seem to be as passionate about multi-ethnic church, to be honest.
Why do you think that is? Does it feel like, we tried that before, or you know what I'm saying? I
think part of it is fear.
Sure.
Again, the Black church is historically it's all we've had.
Right.
And so to take that away feels like your heart is being ripped out. So that's the first thing. Like to take that away feels like, man, like my heart. We're not the Black church. This is what has sustained us. This is the only thing that we have.
Yeah. Right.
And we have to give that up to white folks. Like this is the one thing that is ours, where we can, find community and dignity and respect. And now you want us to let them into this, so there's this notion of wrestling with like, this is all we got. And now they want that too. You know what I'm saying? Like, honestly, that's where people are struggling. So struggling with that, and then just the fear and apprehension, you know, because in the Black community, a lot of us struggle to trust white people. And it's based on history. It's also based on experiences. The movie Malcolm X came out in the 90s, starring Denzel Washington, right? And there's this scene in the movie where he's meeting with the Nation of Islam guy when he's in jail. And he's talking to him about the white man being the devil and God being black. And this is blowing Malcolm's mind. Now, I'm not agreeing with that theology.
We're not supporting that.
Right. I'm not. Yeah. I mean, the Nation of Islam, especially in that time, definitely had some weird kind of theological construct that was even outside of what Orthodox Islam is and was at that time. So I add that disclaimer. But he was being taught by the nation that the white man is the devil, right? And in Malcolm's mind, there's a scene where they show these flashbacks. And basically, it's almost every experience he's ever had with a white person in his life has been this negative, dehumanizing experience. Like it shows the white school teacher, when he told his teacher he wanted to be a lawyer, how she laughed at him, was like, oh, you're a colored boy. You'll never be a lawyer. You know, it flashed back to the white police officer that murdered his dad because he was doing voter registration. You know, the white social worker that after his mom kind of has a break with reality, who comes and takes him. He just has a flashback, you know, to the judge that gave him all these, you know, years that was unfair. Like it's a flashback to every white person he's had an interaction with. And after the flashback in his mind, he was like, oh yeah, the white man is the devil. You know, and so he connects it to his experience in a very unhealthy way. His experiences were genuine in his mind, but it led him to this unhealthy conclusion of white people. You know what I'm saying? And that's the challenge, of course, is history, because we look at history and we see, you know, again, in our nation since 1619, what the challenges have been. But then there's this experience of racism, and experience of moments and experiences that make a lot of Black folk just not trusting white people. And so this notion of, it's not only feeling like a power struggle of now they're going to come and take our church, but it's also, I don't know if I can trust these folk. You know, and for a lot of folks, I'm telling you, growing up Black is always like, you know, you can't trust them white folks. You know, there's this underlying, like, I don't know. You know, because again, history paints this narrative that white folk come in and take over. That's what they do. They take. You know, and there's a narrative that is often embraced in our community that's what white people do. And so there's this fear of, you know, now we have to sacrifice our church and give them that. And they're going to come in and do everything their way. And so there's this fear that if we become multi-ethnic, it means we're becoming white. Another issue I think is
helpful.
Is intimacy. I think as Black folk, we have to learn more and more how to be intimate and free and open around and in the midst of white people. And it's a difficult thing to do. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, talks about the double consciousness of the Black man. And what he means is when you're Black, you have to exist in two different worlds. You're an insider and an outsider at the same time. So because of dominant culture, you have to learn dominant culture, but then you also have your culture as a minority. And so there's this kind of dichotomy that exists with how you move in Black culture, but having to understand the rules and norms of dominant culture at the same time. And so for many of us, you know, when you get around white folks, you automatically switch into this understanding of dominant culture. I think the word is code switching, they call it. Even how you talk change sometimes. Because now you're conscious that you've entered this other cultural place that doesn't understand the nuances of your culture. And so now you have conformed temporarily for the sake of fitting in. Because you got to operate in this other culture. Where the rules seem different and the language is different. And what's viewed as, you know, it's just a different place. And so now you take that to church. And now church is the place you can be yourself and be unashamedly Black in worship style and singing out and stomping your foot. Because one thing that pain taught Black folks is how to praise God.
Oh, man.
The pain and trauma has caused us to cling to worship. in a really life-giving way. And so the black church is loud and unashamedly so because trauma has taught us how to cry out to God.
Wow.
But so now in church, enter white people. And so now you're wrestling with this consciousness. Now, do I conform to white church? Or do I scream amen at the top of my lungs and wave my hands? And then when I do, is it going to be cool? Or are people going to look at me like?
Right.
And some of the disasters of multi-ethnic church. I forgot the book that I read. Dr. Corey Edwards, I think is her name. She was a Christian sociologist that did like studies, started to get into multi-ethnic church. And she tells a story of a multi-ethnic church that failed epically.
Yeah.
And part of the problem was that dominant culture took over. And so she tells a story of a black pastor preaching and one of the black parishioners, catching the Holy Ghost, what they call it. But just exuberant expression of faith and how awkward it was and how she was kind of ushered out of the room and he almost apologized for her expression. Because how it impacted the white folk in the room that felt like they weren't used to. And so it helped. And that was just one story out of many that kind of, that she says led to the demise of that particular multi-ethnic church. Because it was embrace of diversity, quote unquote, but not actual unity in terms of culture.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
I do.
And so there's this burden that when black folks are in worship with white folks, we have to adjust. You know what I mean? And
adjust in a place that should be the freest of anywhere we go all week, regardless of background, regardless of culture or subculture. Like this is the place to freely express to the Lord pain, joy, all of those things in whatever way. I mean, that should be the place of freedom.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you're going to worship the Lord, you're going to cry out and weep because your week has been terrible. Cry out and weep. You're going to scream with joy. You're going to stomp your feet. You're going to clap. You're going to sit there quiet. Okay to all of it. We're going to praise the Lord. This place is a place of freedom because it's about him, not us. Yeah. And
don't sit there quiet. Let me jump in.
I think there's times of worship where you're contemplating. I'm saying when we praise together, I'm separating praise and worship. We don't need to go into this theological.
I just wanted to.
I see you.
There ain't no quiet praise.
Yeah, there's quiet reflection, not praise. But fair enough. But I think you talk about a place that should be comfortable with the uncomfortable, that should be able to embrace the awkward, as we say, maybe once a week. It has to be church. Yeah. That has to be the place where we accept all of that stuff. Now, there's unacceptable worship. We could go into that at another time. But that's not what we're talking about at all. We should be able to accept all of those things.
Yeah, and the challenge is in a lot of predominantly white spaces, particularly in church, they're it's dismissive of black church culture. Black in the sense that those people are just expressive.
Right.
And it's not.
I was going to say it's dismissive in the sense of it's either dismissing it or putting it off as almost a show or something that's neat to watch. And that's even like when we started doing One Voice stuff, we said we don't want it to be a field trip. Yeah, we want people worshiping together. We want at every level to be a multi-ethnic, from greeting to praying together, to worshiping together, to speaking, to every level, to be multi-ethnic, not just a come and watch the show.
And let me give some backstory for our viewers and listeners that may not know what Matt just referenced. So we were, at one point, we were a part of different churches. Matt was a lead pastor at a church. David was staff there. I was a lead pastor at a different church. And we started bringing our congregations together. My church was predominantly black. His was predominantly white. And we started doing Sunday morning services together because we felt this sense that we should come together. And so as we were planning it and thinking it through, to Matt's point, we didn't want it to feel like we were visiting. Like this Sunday, we're going to visit a white church.
Right.
Oh, they do it this way. This Sunday, we're going to visit a black church. Oh, they do it that way. We didn't want it to feel like a field trip.
Absolutely.
And so what we did was we merged our teams. So we put our worship teams together, our greeting teams together, the folk that did like our kids zone stuff.
Every step.
Because we wanted people to come in and right away feel like our two churches were actually doing ministry together, that we were doing Sunday morning together, that it didn't feel like a field trip. Right. It didn't feel like a novelty act because there was more depth to it.
Absolutely. So it wasn't one culture being dominant. It's like, how do we worship God together? How do we preach together, what we ended up doing most of the time was rotating pulpits, and we would switch, and the opposite person of where we were would speak. So if I was at your place, I would speak. If we were at my place, you would speak. That's typically how we did it. We shook it up a little bit.
Yeah,
but.
That's right. That's right.
Wild.
Yeah. But there's just this thought sometimes to be dismissive of how Black folk engage in worship in dominant culture.
Yeah.
And it's not everywhere, but it's pronounced enough to be a problem. And it's dismissive that, they're just emotional and animated. But no, like exuberant praise is extremely biblical.
Extremely.
Like the Bible over and over, sing out to the Lord, clap your hand, make
Bang
a joyful
cymbals.
noise. Yeah, all of these expressive, I did a sermon on praise and worship years ago, and I said there's no such thing as quiet praise.
Right.
Like it doesn't exist.
Right.
You can't make a joyful noise quietly in your seat. And shout out to the white churches that engage in exuberant praise and worship, that understand the biblical mandate to love on God, in an expressive way. Right. You know what I mean? Like,
that's good.
So to dismiss it as Black and not even view it as biblical,
right?
Can sometimes be viewed as offensive. And it's not to say that people aren't in different places. I get like people, your first time at church,
sure,
you're not going to jump. You're not going to, possibly. I understand the nuances. But the idea that when Black folk come into church with white people, we automatically have to tone everything down for the comfort of white people. It is the challenge to multi-ethnic church and one of the issues for Black congregants. And part of the thing is to be fair, in a lot of senses, nobody's telling you or us to tone it down.
Right.
But it's a microcosm of what happens, just in the world around us.
And culture.
When you go into work or when you go into this, like we're so programmed through this dichotomy to switch it up when we get with white people that we bring that to church.
That's helpful.
And so one of the solutions I think is relationship and getting closer to people.
Yeah.
And spending time with people. You know what I'm saying?
Because then trust can be built.
Yeah.
You're not worried about stepping wrong or stepping incorrect. And I think that's even both directions in terms of ethnicities. White folks worrying that you're going to say something and be accused of being racist, or Black folks wondering, do I step wrong this way, or do I have to adhere to majority culture? Can I be myself? I think there's things to learn of both, and relationships helps all sides.
Yeah. And I said all that to bolster my point about intimacy. I mean, honestly, that's what all of that is about, about the ability for Black folk to have a degree of intimacy and openness and freedom around white people. And it sounds silly, but the cultural construct that's been built in America makes that a more difficult barrier than you would think. And that's, like the freedom, to just worship. But I think a lot of that comes from relationship. I think, even with the church we're building, it's awkward at times, but I think the more you come, the more you engage, eventually yourself is going to sink out. You know what I mean? Like you can only hold it in for so long. I mean, just think about with any relationship. Like with any personal relationship, we're always
pull it off for a while.
You always put your best foot forward for a little while. I tell the joke when people are dating, they send their representative. So the first few months is their representative. It's the most kind, considerate version. But after 6, 8, 10 months, you get to see the real person.
Yeah, that's really good.
And so it's
that's really
but
good.
It's a similar thing in relationship. The longer you go through it and as you get closer to people, certain walls are broken down. You know what I mean? And there becomes this openness. And so we have to intentionally pull those walls down. And allow expression, and make spaces for Black theology to be seen in conjunction with white theology. And in that I mean, theologians and quotes and the brilliance of the church and who we use even when we're preaching and all those kinds of things, so that we can create this space where there is this sense of not comfort but belonging. And that's what we're getting to.
That's good.
Because a lot of times it's not about
comfort. That's a good distinction.
Yeah, because some people see this and like, well, why are we trying to appease and make? No, it's about belonging. It's about people coming into the church that the world has told them white people don't accept them. And then coming into the church where there are white people and then feeling loved and accepted and represented. Because
that is a great distinction.
Yeah, because that's one of the hurdles. One of the hurdles of multi-ethnic church is that we exist in a society where Black folk feel like outsiders. So when we come to church, will we feel like an outsider in this church as well?
That's good.
And that's real. And that's the tension, that's the wrestling match. And that's why Black congregants are reluctant to give up Black church.
Man, that's helpful.
That's good. Just another thought I had is I feel like there's kind of three cultures that we're trying to work through. We've got white culture, Black culture, but also we're trying to create kingdom culture.
Yeah.
Right? Like we want to be the most biblical, you know, the most focused on Jesus and living out the gospel as best we can and like build God's kingdom and have his culture.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we can't use that as an excuse to ignore the realities that we bring a white culture, we bring Black culture, and that stuff has to be talked about and recognized and kind of dealt with, even though together we are pursuing kingdom, we're pursuing Jesus's culture, you know? Right. But I think it's so important that we do the work to understand and talk through how bringing those cultures together is difficult and the challenges that there are, and so that we can truly pursue kingdom culture together.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, we need to do so much more life together. And I know a lot of times Black folk are resistant to that because of trust, because of issues of culture and experience and other things. But the key to church and building these communities or this community is doing life together. Yeah. And it's such an important piece, and it's hard to get away from. We talk about the answers and racial reconciliation and multi-ethnic church and all these things, and we can't get away from relationships. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like it's such an important part. Yeah. Because relationships do so many different things. Again, Dr. Eric Mason, and I want to say this quote: proximity breeds empathy. So there's something to being around people that helps you understand them better. Yeah. And you view them as individuals and people and not as some generalization. And so relationship helps you resist the urge to generalize people. Because that's such a dangerous thing in modern American culture, right? We generalize people. White people are this. Republicans are that. Yeah. Democrats are like, there's such this broad sweeping generalization.
Sweeping.
It's not even work. No. Broad sweeping generalization of people where we so easily put people in these camps. But relationships allow us to break down, So in my own life, whenever I'm tempted to say white people are, I have to stop. Because of like my relationship with guys like you and, like friendships and our families. And absolutely. My kids call y'all uncle. You know what I mean?
I know. I heard that the other day and it blessed my heart so much. Yeah, oh my gosh, it blessed my heart.
There's a depth of relationship that is so authentic.
Yeah, for sure.
That whenever I'm tempted to generalize and say white people are this, I can't do it. Right. Because there's this depth of relationship that exists in my life. And it's connected to Derwin Gray's statement. Shout out to Derwin Gray, Transformation Church, that you can't lead a multi-ethnic church if you don't have a multi-ethnic life. Yeah. Ooh. You know what I mean? Like when he said that, it's always been such a profound statement. Yep. If our lives aren't multi-ethnic, we can't expect to lead multi-ethnic churches because it's not a program. It's not a good idea. It is a lifestyle. Yeah. We have to immerse ourselves.
You can't fake it.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't pretend and just go through motions. You can't token multi-ethnic church or it's a failure. There's no way.
And one of the things I said kind of early on in our journey as we were beginning to talk to leaders in our churches about our plan to come together and create One Voice Church was that this doesn't work if I'm just a Black pastor saying, I need a white pastor to plant a church with. Yep. Like it can't just be that. Yep. This was birthed out of us being friends for at the time 7 or 8 years, like just friends. Right. You know what I'm saying?
For sure.
And out of that ministry developed. So it wasn't just the thought that I want to plant, and that's not a bad thought. So I'm not knocking the notion of I want to find a leader that's a different ethnicity because I think we can do church together. Yeah. But it has to just be born out of a depth of relationship with that person. Yeah. You know,
something authentic has to happen.
Yeah, it can't
you just start there, but then that authentic relationship has to build. Yeah. Or else, how are you going to go through the storms? Because storms are coming. If you're a multi-ethnic church, problems, awkward conversations, painful conversations and situations are coming. So unless you are authentic in your relationship, you're not going to get through it.
Yeah, and I would even say it's advantageous to build the relationship first.
Yeah, of course.
Before ministry. I mean, short the voice of God telling you to do something different. Yeah. Like the rule of thumb is you want to build the relationship first. You know, because 7 years of friendship, 6 years of friendship with us help pave the way for what we're doing now.
Right.
And so I don't have a doubt about what we're doing. I don't have a doubt in your characters. You know, like there's no discomfort at any level. Well,
we know quite a bit. No, it's not a joke. It's a It's funny that you thought I was going there, but we know the reality of each other's weaknesses. Yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah, so I was laughing about it because I'm thinking of our weaknesses as I'm saying it. But like, as we step forward to do things, we know what each of us are gifted at and what we are not gifted at. If you want someone to write up notes and things and record that, I'm not doing that junk because no one's going to be able to read it later. Even if I type it out, you're not going to make any sense out of it. You know what I'm saying? But we know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we know that because we have that relationship stepping forward. Yeah. And I think that's true of any church you're building, but especially if you're trying to be multi-ethnic in your direction.
Yeah, well, because the borders are that much higher. When it comes to in the culture we live in, the world we live in, there's such a distinction between white and black, and there's such almost polarizing opposition. So that you're right. It's true of any relationship. But specifically, we start talking about multi-ethnic in America against the backdrop of race issues. Yeah. And the way people even view church through the lens of race. So it's that much more important to do it in that context. Yeah.
Good.
But yeah, we have our challenges ahead of us. But yeah, I pray for the day when America no longer needs a black church because the church is multi-ethnic.
Or a white church.
The church is meeting. Yeah.
We just need a multi-ethnic.
We just need the church.
Yes, we just need the church.
Yeah, that's the call. All right, well, I think we should shut it down. What y'all think?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Bridge the Divide. We love you guys. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast.
Thanks for listening to Bridge the Divide. Special thanks to Chris Marvin for the theme music and Kendra Hayes for staying awesome. We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at bridgethedividepodcast@gmail.com. If you found this podcast helpful, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and share this episode with a friend. See you next time on Bridge the Divide podcast.